Honesty. It's a word that we often hear praised. It's a value that we are taught from a young age to always tell the truth, to be open and transparent, to never hide what's in our hearts. We believe that sharing our thoughts and feelings with the people we love is the best way to strengthen our relationships, to build trust and understanding. But what happens when too much honesty, when sharing every truth, no matter how painful, ends up doing more harm than good? What happens when we realize that some things are better left unsaid, even with the people who love us the most? I learned this lesson the hard way. The first time I overshared, it was a Sunday afternoon when it all started. My family had gathered for one of our regular get-togethers, a small Sunday dinner at my parents' house. We were sitting around the table, enjoying the food and chatting about the usual things, work, the kids, some recent events. But then the conversation shifted to something a bit more personal. My father always wanted to ask questions about my life, asked how my relationship was going. I paused. It was a simple question, but my answer was anything but simple. You see, my relationship had been struggling. My partner and I had been facing some difficulties, and I wasn't sure where things were going. I had been keeping it to myself, trying to figure things out on my own. But when my father asked, something inside me snapped. I felt like I had to be honest. I had always prided myself on being open with my family, and this time, I decided to share the truth. Without thinking, I opened up about the issues in my relationship. I told him about the arguments, the misunderstandings, and the doubts that had been weighing on me. I shared things that, in hindsight, I should have kept private, things that were deeply personal to me and my partner. I thought that by being honest, I would receive understanding, support, and maybe some advice. But instead, the room fell silent. My mother's face tightened with concern, my father's brow furrowed, and my siblings exchanged uncomfortable glances. No one said anything at first. They were all processing what I had just said, and I could tell that my honesty had caught them off guard. The aftermath. As the evening went on, I could feel the tension in the air. My family, who had always been supportive, seemed distant, as though they didn't know how to react to what I had shared. It was as though I had opened a door to something they weren't prepared to face. My mother, trying to hide her worry, asked if I was sure about the relationship, if I had thought about whether it was worth continuing. My father, always the pragmatic one, suggested that I should take a step back and really think about what I wanted. They meant well, of course. They wanted to help. But in their attempts to offer advice, they inadvertently made me feel even worse. The weight of their concern, their judgment, was heavy on my shoulders. I had hoped for comfort and reassurance, but instead I felt more alone in my struggle. The truth, it seemed, had only complicated things. As the night ended, I felt a knot in my stomach. I hadn't expected this. I hadn't expected that being honest, sharing my truth, would create this distance between me and my family. I had hoped that by opening up, I would feel supported, but instead, I felt exposed, vulnerable, and even more uncertain about my relationship than before. The lesson learned. In the days that followed, I reflected on what had happened. I realized that while honesty is important, there are times when it's not the best approach, especially when it comes to our personal struggles. Not every issue needs to be shared with our families. Some things are too complex, too personal, or too painful to discuss openly. I had always believed that transparency was the best way to build trust with my family, but now I saw that some truths can create more harm than good. Some problems are better handled privately, between the people directly involved. My family loved me and they wanted to help, But by sharing too much, I had placed a burden on them that they weren't prepared to carry. I had unintentionally made them worry, made them feel helpless in the face of my struggles. It was a hard lesson, but one I needed to learn. I realized that some things are better kept to myself. I don't need to share every detail of my life with my family to feel close to them. Sometimes the most loving thing I can do is to protect them from unnecessary worry and keep certain things private. The wisdom of silence. In the end, I learned that knowing when to speak and when to stay silent is one of the most important skills we can develop in our relationships. Sharing our truth is vital, but it's equally important to know when holding back can protect the people we love from unnecessary pain or concern. Sometimes silence isn't about hiding something, it's about knowing when to shield others from the burden of our struggles, and that in itself is an act of love. Love is a complicated thing. It's beautiful, messy, and often unpredictable. When we're in the middle of a relationship, whether it's new or long term, we feel compelled to share everything, the highs, the lows, the emotions that swirl within us. We want to talk about the fights, the sweet moments, and everything in between. But sometimes the more we share with our families about our romantic lives, the more complicated it becomes. Sometimes silence is the best choice. I learned this lesson after I had shared too much about my past relationships with my family and the fallout that followed. Looking back, I realized that there are things about romantic relationships that should remain private, things that, when shared, can create more harm than good. The first mistake. It was during one of those family dinners where everyone was catching up. My cousin Sarah had just gotten engaged, and naturally, the topic of relationships came up. My parents asked how my relationship was going, and for a moment, I hesitated. I knew things weren't perfect, but I felt the need to be honest. I wanted to share my struggles with them, to get advice, to feel understood. So I told them everything. I shared the tension between me and my partner, the arguments that had started to pop up more frequently. I confided in them about the doubts I had, the questions about whether we were truly right for each other. I told them that I wasn't sure where the relationship was heading. I thought that by sharing my feelings, they would understand and offer support, just like they always had with everything else. But instead of understanding, I was met with a series of reactions that I wasn't prepared for. My mother, who had always been my biggest supporter, looked at me with concern, almost disappointment. "Why are you even questioning it?" she asked. "If you love each other, you should work through it." My father, trying to be the voice of reason, said, "Love is about commitment, about pushing through the hard times. You can't just give up at the first sign of trouble." Their response, though well-meaning, felt like a judgment. They didn't understand what I was going through, and by sharing too much with them, I had made things more complicated. I had shared my doubts, and now those doubts were all they could see. They didn't understand the full picture, the love, the laughter, and the beautiful moments. They only saw the struggles. The fallout. The days that followed were filled with awkwardness. My parents kept bringing up my relationship, trying to offer solutions, giving advice I didn't ask for. They asked questions that made me feel defensive, questions that made me feel like I wasn't living up to their expectations of what a relationship should look like. "Have you tried couples therapy?" my mom asked. Or, "Maybe you need to spend more time together, just the two of you." But what they didn't understand was that it wasn't just about spending time together or seeking therapy. It was about the emotional distance that had started to form, the things we couldn't communicate, the underlying issues that neither of us were ready to face. By sharing my doubts, I had made my family part of my relationship problems. I had given them a glimpse into something they couldn't fix, something that was too complex to be solved with a simple solution. And instead of feeling supported, I began to feel more isolated. The realization, after a few weeks of awkward conversations and unsolicited advice, I realized something important. Not everything in a relationship needs to be shared with your family. Some things, no matter how close you are better kept private. Your family, no matter how well-intentioned, will always have their own opinions. They may not see the whole picture, and by sharing too much, you may inadvertently create more tension and judgment. I realized that while I trusted my family, their advice wasn't always what I needed. They didn't know the complexities of my relationship, the nuances of the things that made us work. They only saw the struggles I had shared with them, and by focusing on the negative aspects, they inadvertently planted seeds of doubt in my mind. The power of silence. Looking back, I understand now that silence can sometimes be more powerful than words. When it comes to romantic relationships, there's a level of privacy that should be maintained. Not every argument, every doubt, or every frustration needs to be shared with your family. Sometimes the best way to protect your relationship and maintain your own peace of mind is to keep certain things to yourself. It's not about hiding things from your family, but about recognizing that some aspects of your relationship are yours to navigate on your own. Relationships are complicated and they require space to grow, to evolve, and to heal. By sharing too much, we may unintentionally make things harder for ourselves and the people we love. The lesson learned. What I've learned from this experience is that silence in relationships isn't about secrecy. It's about discretion. It's about knowing when to share and when to protect your relationship from external interference. It's about understanding that not every aspect of your romantic life needs to be explained to your family. They love you and they want to help. But sometimes the best help you can give yourself is to work through your issues privately. And above all, I've learned that not everything in life needs to be shared. There's a power in holding certain things close to your chest, a power that allows you to protect your relationship, your emotions, and your sense of self. Sometimes the best way to show love is to respect the boundaries between family and the personal spaces of our hearts. There are moments in life when we feel like we've failed, moments when our plans, our dreams, and our efforts fall apart. These failures, whether big or small, often weigh heavily on our hearts, leaving us feeling inadequate, lost, or ashamed. But the hardest part of failure isn't always the event itself. It's the struggle to admit it to the people we love most. I've had my fair share of personal failures. Some of them were small missteps, others were monumental. But regardless of their size, one thing was constant. I never shared them with my family. I couldn't bring myself to admit to them that I wasn't as successful, as confident, or as capable as they thought I was. I couldn't bear the thought of disappointing them. And so I kept these struggles to myself. But over time, I've learned that sometimes keeping these failures a secret only makes them heavier to bear. Sometimes sharing them is not a sign of weakness, but a step toward healing and growth. The weight of expectations. I had always been the successful one in my family. I was the one who got the good grades, the one who always seemed to have things under control. My parents were proud of me, and I worked hard to maintain that image. But with that success came a weight, the weight of their expectations. They believed in me, and they expected great things from me. They wanted me to keep rising, to keep achieving, and I couldn't afford to let them down. But what they didn't know was that beneath that exterior of success, I was struggling. I was afraid. I was afraid that I wasn't living up to their expectations, that I wasn't as good as they thought I was. And rather than share these fears, I kept them hidden. I pretended that everything was fine, that I had it all together, even when I was falling apart on the inside. I remember the first time I truly failed, the first time I had a major setback. It was during a job I had worked so hard to get, and I was sure I was going to be promoted. But when the promotion didn't come through, I felt crushed. I had put everything into that job, and the rejection felt like a reflection of my worth. I didn't know how to handle it. I couldn't tell my family because I was afraid they would be disappointed, that they would think less of me. Instead, I kept it to myself. I went home, smiled through dinner, and pretended like everything was okay. But inside, I was shattered. The silent struggle. As the years passed, I continued to carry the weight of these unspoken failures. Every time I didn't meet an expectation or didn't achieve a goal, I kept it to myself. I stopped talking about my struggles because I didn't want to disappoint anyone. I wanted to be seen as the person who always succeeded, the one who had it all figured out. But the more I hid, the more the weight of my failures grew. It wasn't just about my career, it was about everything: relationships, finances, personal growth, all the areas where I felt like I wasn't measuring up. I was constantly comparing myself to others, wondering why I couldn't achieve what they had. I was drowning in self-doubt, but I couldn't share it. I couldn't let anyone see how much I was struggling. Every time my family asked me how I was doing, I said the same thing: everything's fine. But it wasn't. Nothing was fine. I felt like I was failing at everything, and yet I kept pushing forward, pretending that everything was okay. The realization: one evening after a particularly tough day at work, I sat down and thought about everything. The weight of my unspoken struggles had become too much to carry. I had spent so much time pretending that I had it all together that I had lost sight of who I was. I realized that by keeping my failures a secret, I was only making things harder for myself. I wasn't giving myself the chance to heal or grow because I was too busy hiding my flaws. I thought about my family. They loved me unconditionally. Why was I so afraid to admit my struggles to them? They had always been there for me, through thick and thin. And yet, I had kept them at arm's length, not allowing them to see the real me. The person who wasn't perfect, who wasn't always successful, who didn't have all the answers. That night, I made a decision. I decided that I would stop hiding. I would open up to my family about my struggles, no matter how ashamed I felt. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I couldn't keep living with this burden. I needed to let go of the fear of disappointing them and allow myself to be vulnerable. The conversation. The next weekend, I sat down with my parents. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I told them everything: the struggles I had faced, the failures I had hidden, and the fear that had consumed me for so long. I cried as I spoke, not out of weakness, but out of relief. For the first time, I allowed myself to be honest about my pain. To my surprise, they didn't judge me. They didn't see me as weak or a failure. They simply listened. They hugged me and told me that they loved me no matter what. They reassured me that failure wasn't the end, that it was just part of the journey, and that it didn't define who I was. That conversation changed everything. For the first time in years, I felt a weight lifted off my shoulders. I realized that my family wasn't expecting perfection from me. They just wanted me to be happy and at peace with myself. And most importantly, I learned that sharing my struggles, rather than hiding them, was the key to healing. The lesson learned. Looking back, I realized that the unspoken struggles we carry are often the heaviest. We think that by hiding our failures, we protect ourselves and our families from disappointment. But in reality, it's the silence that hurts us the most. By keeping our struggles to ourselves, we prevent ourselves from healing, from growing, and from receiving the support we need. I've learned that it's okay to fail. It's okay to be imperfect. And it's okay to share those failures with the people we love. They're not there to judge us. They're there to help us, to lift us up when we need it most. And so I've learned to let go of the fear of disappointing others and to embrace the vulnerability that comes with being honest about my struggles. It's a lesson that has changed the way I live and one that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Money is a complicated thing. It can bring comfort, security, and freedom, but it can also bring stress, shame, and division. For many of us, finances are one of the most personal aspects of our lives. Yet it's also one of the things we least want to talk about with our families. We want to keep the details of our financial struggles hidden, afraid that sharing them might make us seem irresponsible, weak, or even unworthy of the support and love we receive from those closest to us. But what happens when those financial secrets start to weigh too heavily on our hearts? What happens when keeping the truth to ourselves becomes more damaging than sharing it? I learned this lesson in a way I never expected, and it changed the way I view both money and the relationships I hold most dear. The secret debt. It all started years ago when I made a series of poor financial decisions. At first, it seemed harmless enough, a few credit cards here and there, a loan to cover some unexpected expenses, and before I knew it, I had accumulated more debt than I could handle. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was manageable, that I would figure it out eventually, but the truth was I was overwhelmed. The bills kept piling up, and I was drowning in the weight of what I owed. I couldn't bring myself to tell my family. I was the one who always tried to keep everything together. I was the one who was supposed to have it all figured out. My parents, who had always been financially irresponsible, had set a high bar for me, and I didn't want to disappoint them. I didn't want them to see me as a failure, as someone who couldn't manage their own money, so I kept it a secret. I hid the bills, avoided the calls from creditors, and pretended like everything was fine. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I was lying, not just to my family, but to myself. The growing pressure. As the months passed, the pressure grew. I was juggling multiple payments, borrowing money from one account to pay off another, and constantly worrying about how I would make ends meet. It felt like I was trapped in a never-ending cycle, and the weight of it all was starting to take its toll. The anxiety, the sleepless nights, the constant stress, it all added up. But I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone. Every time my parents asked how I was doing, I put on a brave face and told them everything was fine. I made excuses for why I hadn't been able to visit as much or why I wasn't as available to help out. I didn't want them to ask too many questions, and I certainly didn't want them to find out the truth. In the meantime, the debt continued to grow. The interest rates piled up, and soon I was stuck in a financial hole I couldn't dig myself out of. But I kept quiet, convinced that I was protecting my family from the stress and worry that I was facing. What I didn't realize at the time was that by keeping this secret, I was only making things worse. The breaking point. It wasn't until one day when I was sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by bills that I reached my breaking point. I had run out of options. I was exhausted from trying to keep up the facade, and I realized that I couldn't keep hiding my financial problems from my family any longer. I needed help. I needed their support, but I didn't know how to ask for it. For the first time I broke down, I cried. I admitted to myself that I wasn't okay, that I had made mistakes, and that I needed help getting out of this mess. And for the first time, I realized that I couldn't handle everything on my own. The truth comes out. That evening, I sat down with my parents. My heart was racing, and I was terrified of what they might say. I was afraid that they would be angry, disappointed, or even ashamed of me. But I couldn't carry this burden alone anymore. I told them everything: the credit card debt, the loans, the bills I couldn't pay. I told them how I had been lying to them, how I had been hiding my financial struggles for years, and how I didn't know how to fix it. To my surprise, my parents didn't react the way I thought they would. They didn't judge me. They didn't criticize me for my mistakes. Instead, they listened. They understood. They reassured me that it was okay to ask for help, that everyone makes mistakes, and that we would figure it out together. It wasn't easy to admit my failures, but in that moment, I realized something important. My family wasn't there to judge me. They were there to help me. They wanted to support me, not because they expected perfection, but because they loved me and wanted to see me succeed. The power of honesty. In the weeks that followed, my family helped me create a plan to get my finances back on track. We sat down together and worked through a budget, figured out how to pay off the debt, and made a commitment to be more open about money moving forward. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of stress, but knowing that I had the support of my family made all the difference. I realized that keeping secrets, especially when it comes to finances, only made the situation worse. By hiding my struggles, I had isolated myself, carrying the weight of my debt alone. But by opening up, I was able to find a solution, and more importantly, I was able to reconnect with my family in a way that I hadn't expected. The lesson learned. Looking back, I see how much I learned from this experience. I learned that money is an incredibly personal matter, but it's also something that should be handled with transparency and honesty. Keeping financial secrets from our families doesn't protect them. It only isolates us and creates unnecessary stress. We don't have to handle everything alone. Sometimes asking for help is the bravest thing we can do. I've learned that it's okay to make mistakes, it's okay to fall short, and it's okay to admit that we don't have everything figured out. The key is to be honest with ourselves and the people who care about us. And when we do, we find that we're not alone. We have a support system that will help us rise again. Family, it's supposed to be the one place where we are loved unconditionally no matter what. A place where we can find comfort and support during difficult times. But what happens when the expectations of family become too much to bear? What happens when you find yourself torn between trying to please everyone and realizing that you can never make everyone happy? I've spent so much of my life trying to be the person my family expected me to be. I've tried to be the perfect son, the perfect sibling, the perfect friend. But the more I tried to live up to their expectations, the more I felt like I was losing myself. And in the end, I learned the hard way that trying to please everyone only leads to disappointment for both you and the people you care about. The pressure to meet expectations. From a young age, my family always had big expectations for me. My parents wanted me to succeed, to be someone they could be proud of. They pushed me to excel in school, to make the right choices, and to build a stable, successful future. I felt like I had to live up to their dreams for me. I wasn't just doing things for myself, I was doing them to make them proud. As I grew older, the pressure intensified. My parents, who had always been so supportive, began to voice their expectations more clearly. They wanted me to follow a certain career path, to settle down, and to start a family. They had a vision of what my life should look like, and I felt like I had to fit into that mold. Every time I made a decision, I would wonder, what would my parents think? What would my siblings say? But the more I tried to meet their expectations, the more I felt like I was losing myself. I started making choices based on what I thought would make my family happy, not based on what I truly wanted. I didn't want to disappoint anyone, so I kept pushing myself to do things that didn't feel right. And all the while, I was neglecting my own needs, my own desires. The first sign of trouble. The tension first started to show when I made a career decision that didn't align with my family's vision for me. I had always been interested in the arts, but my parents had always insisted that I go into something practical like business or law. So I spent years studying something I wasn't passionate about, hoping that eventually I would find a way to make it work. But I didn't. And one day I made the decision to change careers and pursue my passion for design. It wasn't an easy decision, and I knew it wouldn't be well received. When I told my parents, their reaction was not what I had hoped for. They were shocked, disappointed, and worried about my future. Why would you throw away all the stability you had? They asked. Don't you want a secure future? Their reaction, though understandable, left me feeling crushed. I had made a decision that was best for me, but in doing so, I had disappointed them. And as much as I tried to explain why I wanted to make this change, I realized that they couldn't understand. They had their own vision for my life, and I was no longer fitting into that picture. The strain in relationships. As time passed, the tension between my family and me grew. I tried to explain my choices, to justify my decisions, but it seemed like no matter what I said, it was never enough. My parents were still disappointed, and my siblings, though more understanding, began to question my decisions as well. The more I tried to defend myself, the more I felt like I was alienating the people I loved. I couldn't please everyone, no matter how hard I tried. At family gatherings, the conversations would turn to my career, my life choices, and what I was doing with my future. Each time I felt like I was under a microscope, like I was being judged for the path I had chosen. I would smile, pretend that everything was fine, and try to change the subject. But deep down, I was frustrated. I wanted my family to support me, to understand that this was my life and my decision. But instead, I felt like I was constantly defending myself, trying to explain why I wasn't living up to their expectations. The realization, one evening after another difficult conversation with my family, I took a step back and thought about everything that had happened. I realized that I had been so focused on pleasing everyone else that I had lost sight of what truly mattered, my own happiness. I had spent so much time trying to meet the expectations of my family that I had neglected my own dreams, my own desires, and my own identity. I had been living for other people. I had been making decisions based on what I thought would make them happy, rather than what would make me happy. And in doing so, I had created a rift between myself and the people I loved. I couldn't please everyone, and I never would. The decision to let go. That night, I made a decision. I realized that it was okay to disappoint my family. It wasn't about rejecting them or their love. It was about accepting that I couldn't live my life according to their expectations. I had to live for myself. I had to pursue my dreams, make my own choices, and follow my own path, even if that meant disappointing the people I cared about. I decided to have a conversation with my family, not to explain or defend my choices, but to simply tell them that I was doing what was best for me. I told them that I loved them, but I needed them to understand that I had to live my life for myself, not for them. I didn't expect their approval, but I needed their respect. The lesson learned. The conversation wasn't easy, and it didn't fix everything right away, but it was a turning point. I learned that trying to please everyone, trying to live up to the expectations of others, is a never-ending cycle. It only leads to frustration, resentment, and a loss of self. The only person we truly need to please is ourselves. Since then, I've made peace with the fact that I can't make everyone happy. I've learned that it's okay to make decisions that are best for me, even if they don't align with what others expect. And I've learned that the people who truly love me will understand, even if they don't always agree with my choices. I can't please everyone, and I don't need to. And in the end, that's the most important lesson I've learned. Self-doubt. It's something that lurks in the back of our minds, quietly and steadily eroding our confidence. It's a battle that many of us face, but few are willing to talk about. We carry the weight of our insecurities, our fear of failure, and the constant questioning of whether we are truly good enough. And we keep it hidden, not just from others, but from ourselves. We tell ourselves we're fine, that everything's okay, but inside the doubt gnaws at us. I never realized how much of a hold self-doubt had over me until I found myself standing at a crossroads in my life. Everything around me seemed to be moving forward, but I felt stuck. I had built a life that looked good on paper, a stable job, a home, a loving family, but I was constantly questioning my own worth. Was I really as successful as everyone thought I was? Did I deserve all of this? Or was I just a fraud, pretending to have it all together? The facade of confidence. For most of my life, I wore a mask of confidence. On the outside, I was the person everyone turned to for advice, the one who always seemed to have the answers, the one who was in control. I took pride in my ability to appear self-assured, even when inside, I was anything but confident. I convinced myself that if I acted confident enough, I could fool everyone, including myself. But the truth was, I was constantly battling the voice in my head that told me I wasn't good enough. That voice would whisper, "You don't belong here. You're not as talented as they think. You're going to mess up." Every time I took on a new challenge, that voice would grow louder. It didn't matter how much success I achieved. It didn't matter how many compliments I received. Nothing was ever enough to silence the doubt. No matter how much I accomplished, I always felt like I was on the verge of failure. And I was terrified that one day someone would figure out that I was just pretending to be competent, pretending to be confident. The inner struggle. The hardest part of self-doubt is that it's invisible. No one can see it, not even the people closest to us. On the outside, I was doing just fine. But inside, I was fighting a battle that no one knew about. I struggled with my own thoughts, my own perception of myself, and the constant fear that I wasn't enough. And the more I tried to hide it, the worse it became. I would lie awake at night, replaying every conversation, every decision, and every mistake in my head. I would ask myself, Did I say the wrong thing? Did I make the right choice? The fear of making a mistake was paralyzing. I started avoiding new opportunities because I was afraid of failing, afraid of being exposed as a fraud. I began to shrink away from situations that challenged me, convinced that I wasn't good enough to handle them. But the worst part was the shame. I felt ashamed of my self-doubt. I was supposed to be confident. I was supposed to have it all together. I didn't want anyone to see the fear that lived inside me. So I kept it to myself, convinced that if I didn't share it, no one would know. The fear of disappointment. I realized that my self-doubt was deeply tied to the fear of disappointing others. I had spent so much of my life trying to meet everyone's expectations that I had forgotten to consider my own. I didn't want to let anyone down. I didn't want my family to think I wasn't living up to their hopes for me. They had always believed in me, and I had always worked hard to live up to that belief. But the truth was, I was terrified of failing them. I had never allowed myself to ask for help or to admit when I was struggling. I kept everything to myself, thinking that I had to be the strong one, the one who could handle everything on my own. But by doing that, I only isolated myself. I didn't give anyone the chance to support me, to help me through my struggles. I was so focused on keeping up the facade of perfection that I was suffocating beneath the weight of my own expectations. The turning point. The turning point came during a family gathering. My cousin, who had always been close to me, was going through a tough time, and I found myself in the position of offering advice and support. But this time, I felt different. I didn't feel like the strong one. I didn't feel like I had all the answers. I felt vulnerable, unsure of myself, and afraid that I wouldn't be able to help her. For the first time, I admitted to her that I didn't have all the answers. I told her that I was struggling too, that I wasn't as confident as I appeared. It wasn't easy. I had spent so many years pretending to have everything figured out, and now I was admitting that I didn't. But in that moment, I realized that vulnerability was not a weakness. It was a strength. The power of sharing. After that conversation, something shifted. I began to open up to my family more, to share my doubts and fears with them. It was uncomfortable at first, but slowly I started to let go of the shame that had been holding me back. I started to accept that self-doubt was a natural part of life and that it didn't define who I was. It was just a feeling, something that would pass, and I didn't have to let it control me. The more I shared, the lighter I felt. My family didn't judge me. They didn't think less of me. They offered their support, their understanding, and their love. And through that support, I began to heal. I began to see that my self-doubt didn't make me weak. It made me human. We all have our struggles, and it's okay to be vulnerable, to admit that we're not perfect. The lesson learned. I've learned that self-doubt is something that many of us face, but it doesn't have to define us. It's okay to feel uncertain, to question ourselves. What matters is not letting that doubt control us. It's about acknowledging it, understanding it, and not letting it prevent us from living our lives. I've also learned that it's okay to ask for help, to lean on others when we're struggling. We don't have to carry our doubts and fears alone. Sharing them, talking about them is the first step toward overcoming them. And in doing so, we allow ourselves to heal and grow. In the end, I've come to accept that self-doubt is just one part of the journey. It's not something to be ashamed of, but something to work through. And with the support of the people we love, we can learn to quiet that voice of doubt and embrace the strength within ourselves. We are all born into a world of expectations. Expectations from our parents, our families, society, and sometimes even from ourselves. We're taught from a young age that there's a certain path to follow in life, a road that's paved with success, stability, and happiness. But what happens when your path doesn't match the one that others have envisioned for you? What happens when you make choices that go against the grain, against what's expected, and against the way others think your life should unfold? I've spent much of my life trying to meet the expectations of my family, trying to live up to the dreams they had for me. But as I got older, I began to realize that the life I was leading wasn't the one I truly wanted. It wasn't my own path. It was a path that had been laid out for me, one that I had followed without questioning, without considering what I truly wanted out of life. But when I finally made the choice to follow my own path, a path that didn't align with anyone's expectations but my own, I learned some of the most valuable lessons of my life. And though it wasn't easy, I came to understand that the best decisions I made were the ones I made for myself, not for anyone else. The pressure to conform. Growing up, I was always told that I needed to follow a certain path to be successful. My parents had clear expectations for me. They wanted me to go to a prestigious college, land a high-paying job, and settle down with a family. They believed that this was the formula for happiness and success, and for a long time I believed them. I followed the steps they had set out for me. I went to college, graduated with honors, and started a job in a field I thought was right for me. On the surface, everything looked perfect. I had a good job, a steady income, and a stable life. But deep down, I knew something was missing. I wasn't happy. I wasn't passionate about what I was doing. I was simply going through the motions, trying to meet the expectations that had been placed on me. But the more I tried to live up to those expectations, the more I felt like I was losing myself. I realized that I was living a life that wasn't my own. I was chasing someone else's dream, not my own. The moment of realization came when I found myself in a job that I hated. I was working long hours, sitting in meetings, and doing tasks that didn't inspire me. I was earning a good salary, but I felt empty inside. I had achieved everything that my family had wanted for me, but I wasn't fulfilled. I wasn't happy. One evening, after another grueling day at work, I sat down and thought about my life. I asked myself, is this really what I want? Is this the life I've worked so hard to create? And for the first time, I realized that it wasn't. It wasn't my life. It wasn't the life I had imagined for myself. It was the life that others had imagined for me. The decision to change. That night, I made a decision. I decided that I would no longer live my life according to the expectations of others. I would no longer follow a path that didn't make me happy. I would find my own way, even if it meant disappointing my family, even if it meant stepping away from the life I had worked so hard to build. It wasn't an easy decision. I knew that my family would be disappointed, that they would question my choices, that they would worry about my future. But I also knew that I had to be true to myself. I couldn't keep living someone else's dream. I had to live my own. So I took a leap of faith. I left my mom and I started pursuing a career in something I was passionate about, something I had always loved but had been too afraid to pursue. I began taking classes, working part-time, and slowly building a new life for myself. It wasn't easy, and there were many moments of doubt, but I knew deep down that I was doing the right thing. The struggle with family expectations. When I told my family about my decision, their reaction was not what I had hoped for. They didn't understand. They were worried about my financial stability, my future, and my happiness. Why would you leave a stable job for something uncertain? My mother asked. You've worked so hard to get here. Why throw it all away? Their words were filled with concern, and I understood where they were coming from. They wanted what was best for me, but I also knew that I couldn't live my life based on their fears. I couldn't let their expectations dictate my happiness. I had to make the choice that was right for me, even if it meant going against the grain. The journey of self-discovery. As I embarked on this new journey, I faced many challenges. There were moments of doubt, moments when I questioned whether I had made the right choice. But through it all, I learned more about myself than I ever had before. I discovered what truly made me happy, what truly inspired me, and what I wanted my life to look like. I also learned that the best decisions I made were the ones I made for myself, not for anyone else. I realized that I didn't have to follow the same path that my parents had followed. I didn't have to live the life that society expected of me. I could create my own path, one that aligned with my values, my passions, and my dreams. The peace of living authentically. In the end, I found peace. I found happiness. I found fulfillment in doing work that I loved, in building a life that was true to who I was. I stopped worrying about what others thought of me, and I stopped trying to please everyone. I learned to trust my own instincts, to make decisions based on what felt right for me, and to let go of the fear of disappointing others. And while my family still doesn't fully understand my choices, they have come to respect them. They see that I am happier, that I am thriving, and that I am living a life that is authentically mine. And in the end, that is all that matters. The lesson learned. I've learned that life is not about meeting the expectations of others. It's about finding your own path, making your own decisions, and living a life that is true to yourself. It's about trusting your instincts even when others may not understand. It's about knowing that you can't please everyone, and that's okay. What matters is that you are true to who you are and that you follow the path that makes you happy. Sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that require us to go against the grain, to step away from what is familiar and comfortable. But those are the decisions that lead to growth, to self-discovery, and to a life worth living. Grief is a strange and complex emotion. It can feel like a storm, powerful and overwhelming, taking everything in its path. But what happens when that grief is something you can't share? What happens when the pain is too deep, too personal, put into words? For some, the weight of unspoken grief is unbearable, yet it's a burden they carry in silence, afraid that if they speak about it, the sorrow will become even heavier. I've learned this lesson the hard way, that sometimes the most profound pain is the one we choose to keep hidden. It's the one we don't let anyone see. But even though it is kept in the dark, it shapes who we are, changing us in ways we don't fully understand until much later. The loss that changed everything. The grief I carry started many years ago with the loss of someone I never thought I'd have to live without. It was my sister Mia. We had always been close, two peas in a pod. We laughed together, cried together, shared our hopes and fears. She was my confidant, my best friend. We made so many plans for the future, dreams of growing old together, supporting each other through everything life had to offer. But life has a way of shattering even the most certain plans. Mia's sudden death took me by surprise. It wasn't a slow goodbye or a long battle. It was sudden, a flash of fate that left me reeling. She was gone in an instant, and I was left behind, not knowing how to navigate the world without her by my side. At first, I tried to grieve in the way everyone expected me to. I cried, I mourned. I went through the motions of a person who had lost something invaluable. But the truth was, I didn't know how to share that grief. I didn't know how to explain to anyone how deeply it had affected me. I couldn't bear the thought of burdening my family with the weight of it all. They saw me crying, yes. They saw my sadness, my sorrow. But what they didn't see was the constant ache in my chest, the emptiness that never left. What they didn't see was the endless nights I spent staring at the ceiling, haunted by memories of Mia. What they didn't see was the guilt I carried. Guilt for not having done more, for not having been there enough in her final days. The silence that haunted me. The most difficult part of grief is the silence. The pain that no one sees, the questions that go unasked, and the feelings that are too difficult to put into words. I didn't want to talk about Mia's death with my family. I didn't want them to see the depth of my grief because I knew they were suffering too. I didn't want to add to their pain. I didn't want them to think I was weak or that I was falling apart. So I kept quiet. I smiled when they asked me how I was doing. I told them I was fine, that I was handling it, but inside I was breaking. Every day was a struggle, each moment a reminder of the hole Mia had left in my heart. And the more I kept it to myself, the more isolated I felt. I started to withdraw from my family, afraid that if I opened up, I would collapse under the weight of my grief. I didn't know how to share it without feeling like I was letting them down. The weight of hidden pain. The longer I kept my grief to myself, the heavier it became. It wasn't just the sadness, it was the guilt, the regret, the questions that I couldn't answer. What if I had done something differently? What if I had known the signs? What if I had been able to save her? These questions plagued me, and I felt like I had no one to share them with. I couldn't talk to my parents about it. They were already grieving themselves. I couldn't talk to my friends because they didn't understand. They hadn't experienced the depth of the loss I felt. And so I suffered in silence, carrying this invisible weight that no one could see, but everyone could feel. I was afraid that if I let myself truly feel the pain, I wouldn't be able to control it. I was afraid that if I started to grieve fully, I would never stop. But by keeping it inside, I wasn't allowing myself to heal. I was simply burying the pain deeper and deeper until it consumed me. The moment I couldn't hold it in anymore, there came a point when the weight became too much to bear. I had been holding it together for so long, pretending like I was fine, pretending like I could keep living without Mia. But one day I reached a breaking point. It happened unexpectedly, on an ordinary afternoon, when a memory of Mia hit me like a wave. I couldn't hold back the tears anymore. I cried uncontrollably for the first time since she passed. I sobbed in a way that I hadn't allowed myself to do before, raw, vulnerable, and unashamed. It was then that I realized something important. I couldn't keep this grief inside forever. I couldn't keep pretending that I was okay. I needed to share the pain. I needed to let my family in, to let them see the hurt I had been carrying alone. And so for the first time, I opened up. I told them how much I missed Mia, how I was still trying to make sense of her death, how I felt like I was drowning in my grief. I told them that I didn't know how to keep going without her and that I was afraid I would never heal. The healing power of sharing. To my surprise, my family didn't judge me. They didn't tell me to move on or get over it. They simply listened. They let me cry. And in that moment, I realized that I didn't have to carry the weight of my grief alone. Sharing it, expressing it, was the first step toward healing. I had been afraid that if I shared my grief, I would burden my family. But the truth was, they wanted to help me. They wanted to be there for me, to hold me up when I couldn't stand on my own. And by opening up, I allowed them to do just that. The lesson learned. Looking back, I realized that keeping grief hidden only makes it heavier. It doesn't go away just because we refuse to talk about it. In fact, the more we keep it to ourselves, the more it consumes us. I've learned that it's okay to grieve. It's okay to feel pain, and it's okay to ask for help. By sharing our grief with those we love, we give ourselves the opportunity to heal. And in doing so, we honor the memory of those we've lost. Grief is a personal journey, and everyone deals with it differently. But I've learned that it doesn't have to be a journey we take alone. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is let others in, to let them share our pain and help us carry it. There are days when giving feels like an endless cycle. We give our time, our energy, and our love to the people we care about, hoping that our support will make a difference. We want to be the one who lifts others up, the one who is always there when they need us. But what happens when the constant act of giving starts to take a toll on us? What happens when we realize that we've given so much of ourselves that there's nothing left to give? I've spent years being the person others turn to for support. I've always been the one who listens, who offers advice, who picks up the pieces when others fall apart. But over time, I began to realize something that I had been ignoring for so long. I had been giving so much of myself that I had forgotten to take care of my own needs. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, and feeling more alone than ever. The need to always be there. It started when I was young. I was always the one my family relied on. I was the one who made sure everything was okay, the one who fixed problems before they even became an issue. It felt natural, almost like it was my role in the family. I prided myself on being the strong one, the one who everyone turned to for help. And I didn't mind. In fact, I liked it. It made me feel important, needed, loved. But as the years passed, the requests started to pile up. My siblings would call me for advice. My parents would turn to me when things weren't going well. And my friends would always come to me when they needed someone to listen. I was always available, always ready to help. And the more I gave, the more people came to depend on me. I didn't mind at first. I was happy to help. I was happy to be there for others. But gradually, I started to feel like I was giving more than I had to offer. I was constantly giving my time, my energy, and my emotional support, but I was receiving very little in return. The people I helped were grateful, but they didn't know how much it was costing me. They didn't realize that every time I gave, a part of me was being drained. The silent toll. Over time, I started to feel the toll that constant giving was taking on me. I was emotionally exhausted. Every time someone came to me for help, I felt like I was putting out a part of myself, a part that I didn't have the energy to spare. I began to feel like I was running on empty, constantly giving without ever receiving. I was exhausted, but I didn't know how to stop. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to let anyone down. But I also didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. I began to feel resentful, but I didn't know why. I was doing everything for everyone else, but no one was doing anything for me. I needed help, but I couldn't ask for it. I didn't want to seem weak or selfish or like I couldn't handle things, so I kept giving, even though it was draining me. I started to withdraw from people, not because I didn't care, but because I was too tired to keep up the act of always being okay. I was so focused on helping others that I stopped focusing on myself. I stopped taking care of my own needs, stopped doing the things that made me happy, and stopped allowing myself to feel vulnerable. I was stuck in a cycle of constant giving, and it felt like I was losing myself in the process. The breaking point. It wasn't until one day when I found myself sitting alone in my apartment, feeling completely drained, that I realized something had to change. I had spent so much time taking care of everyone else that I had forgotten to take care of myself. I had been giving without receiving, and now I had nothing left to give. I couldn't keep going like this. I needed to stop. I needed to take a break. But the thought of saying no, of stepping back, felt impossible. I didn't want to disappoint anyone. I didn't want to be the one who let others down. But I also knew that if I didn't start taking care of myself, I would burn out completely. The realization. That night, I took a step back and reflected on everything. I realized that I had been living for everyone else, not for myself. I had been putting other people's needs before my own, and in doing so, I had lost sight of what mattered to me. I had stopped taking care of myself, stopped doing the things that brought me joy, stopped allowing myself to rest. I also realized that constantly giving without receiving wasn't sustainable. I couldn't continue to pour from an empty cup, and if I kept going at the pace I would eventually have nothing left to offer, not just to others, but to myself. I needed to make a change. The change. I made a commitment to myself that night. I decided that I would start saying no. I would stop giving so much of myself to others without taking the time to recharge. I would make space for myself, for my own needs, for my own happiness. I would set boundaries, not because I didn't care about others, but because I cared about myself too. The change wasn't easy. It felt selfish at first, like I was letting people down. But as I began to take better care of myself, I started to realize that I was able to be there for others in a more meaningful way. I wasn't running on empty anymore. I had energy, I had patience, and I had the emotional capacity to help when I needed to. The lesson learned. Looking back, I see now that emotional exhaustion is something we all face at some point in our lives. We want to help. We want to be there for the people we love, but we can't give endlessly without taking care of ourselves. The key is to find a balance, to know when to say yes and when to say no, to know when to give and when to take. I've learned that it's okay to put myself first sometimes. It doesn't make me selfish, it makes me human. We can't pour from an empty cup. And by taking care of ourselves, we can continue to give without losing ourselves in the process. Sometimes the best way to help others is to take a step back and take care of ourselves first. And when we do, we have more to give, more to share, and more to offer. As I look back on everything I've learned over the years, the mistakes I've made, the lessons I've absorbed, one truth stands out more than any other. Sometimes silence is not only golden, it's necessary. There are moments in life when speaking up is essential, when sharing your truth can heal wounds and bring clarity. But there are also moments when silence holds more power than words ever could. For most of my life, I believed that honesty was the best policy, that sharing every detail with my family would keep me close to them, that transparency would build trust. I wanted to be the one who always spoke my mind, the one who always shared my heart. But over the years, I've learned that not every truth needs to be spoken. Not every feeling needs to be shared, and sometimes the best thing you can do is to stay silent, not for the sake of secrecy, but for the sake of peace and understanding. I learned this lesson the hard way. The moments of regret. I've often found myself regretting the things I've said, the truths I've revealed, thinking that perhaps they didn't need to be shared in the first place. The more I think about it, the more I realize that some of the deepest connections I've had with my family were formed not by sharing everything, but by knowing when to hold back, by understanding that silence isn't a sign of distance, but a form of love and respect. I remember the times when I let my frustrations spill over. I remember the arguments, the disagreements that started with my honest words, but spiraled out of control because I didn't know when to stop. My family had their own thoughts, their own experiences, and sometimes my words only served to create more tension than resolution. I wish I had known back then that some battles aren't worth fighting with words. Sometimes the most loving thing to do is to let things be, to allow others the space to come to their own conclusions. The value of silence. There is something powerful about silence. It's not an absence of communication, but a choice to listen more than speak, to understand more than explain. I've come to appreciate the moments when I just sit quietly with my family, not needing to fill the silence with words. These moments have become some of the most meaningful to me, when we don't need to speak to know how we feel about each other, when we don't need to offer advice or try to fix things, but simply let the quiet be enough. There have been times when my family's words, though well-intentioned, only added to my burden. They wanted to help, they wanted to fix things, but what I needed wasn't advice or solutions. What I needed was space to process, time to understand things on my own. I've learned that it's okay to tell them I just need some time, and that in those moments, silence can be the most supportive thing I can ask for. When silence speaks louder than words, sometimes the best conversations are the ones that don't happen. The moments when no one feels the need to explain, to defend, or to argue. When you can simply sit with your family, with your thoughts, and know that everything doesn't need to be said for you to feel understood. Those are the moments when we connect on a deeper level, when we realize that love doesn't always require words. I learned this lesson when I went through a personal crisis a few years ago. I felt lost, overwhelmed, and unsure of my next steps. I didn't want to burden my family with my struggles. I didn't want them to worry, so I kept quiet. For weeks, I carried this weight alone, thinking that I had to figure it all out by myself. But one evening, my father came to sit with me. He didn't ask me what was wrong. He didn't try to fix anything. He simply sat beside me in silence, and after a long pause, he said, "You don't have to talk if you don't want to. I'm just here." That simple act of silence, of being present without any expectation, was more comforting than any words he could have said. In that moment, I realized that silence can be a form of love. It doesn't always have to be filled with explanations or justifications. Sometimes simply being there for someone is enough. The final lesson: as I reflect on everything I've shared with you, I understand now that knowing when to speak and when to stay silent is one of the most important lessons I have learned in life. There's a balance to be struck between honesty and discretion, between expression and restraint. Sometimes speaking up is necessary for growth and understanding, but sometimes staying silent allows us to hear the things that are unspoken, to understand the feelings that words can't express. I've learned that keeping secrets doesn't always mean hiding something bad. Sometimes it means protecting the people we love from unnecessary hurt. Sometimes it means giving them the space to figure things out on their own. And most importantly, it means protecting ourselves, our peace, our sanity, and our emotional well-being. In the end, the most valuable thing I've learned is this: silence is not weakness. Silence is strength. It's the strength to listen when others speak, the strength to understand when words fall short, and the strength to say nothing when saying something would only cause more harm.